A billionaire returned home past midnight, tired, heavy-eyed, still wearing the polite smile he'd been performing all evening. Richard Cole had survived another gala, another night of handshakes, hollow laughter, and the endless ritual of being the man everyone wanted something from. His chauffeur's goodbye echoed faintly as the penthouse doors sealed shut behind him. He exhaled, craving nothing but silence. The city buzzed beyond the glass. Lagos never truly slept, but inside, his world was supposed to be still. The marble floor gleamed beneath the low light, the scent of cologne and fresh polish hanging in the air. It was the kind of silence money could buy. Perfect, controlled, until a hand covered his mouth. Richard froze. Instinct kicked in, every muscle tensed. His pulse thundered. He was about to spin, strike, shout, until he saw her reflection in the glass wall. The maid. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but not for herself. Her hand trembled against his face. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Don't make a sound." For a heartbeat, the world held still, a billionaire silenced by the one person invisible in his house. "What?" he started, but her hand pressed tighter. "Please," she begged again, her tone sharper now, trembling with something deeper than fear. Urgency. Richard grabbed her wrist, ready to pull her away. "Evelyn, what the hell do you think you're doing?" He hissed under his breath. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, and what he saw in them stopped him cold. "Your daughter," she said, barely audible. "She's not in her room." The words hit harder than any slap. He blinked. "What do you mean she's not?" Evelyn didn't wait. She slipped past him, her steps light, fast, silent as wind. Richard followed, confusion twisting into dread. The corridor stretched out before them, long and pale under the glow of recessed lights. At the far end, through the glass wall, he saw it. A small figure standing on the balcony, barefoot, motionless. Amelia. His throat closed. "Amelia!" Evelyn turned sharply, eyes wide. "No, don't call her name." He stopped mid-breath. Her whisper cut through the panic like a command. "She's sleepwalking," Evelyn said. "If you wake her wrong, she could fall." The man who commanded skyscrapers, who could silence boardrooms with a look, suddenly couldn't move. His daughter, pale and still in her nightdress, swayed under the glow of the city lights. One wrong sound, and she could die. Evelyn moved first, slowly, calmly. Her bare feet made no sound against the marble. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, voice low, melodic. "Let's go back inside now." Richard watched, powerless, as the maid he'd never truly seen risked everything to save what mattered most to him. Amelia turned, eyes open but empty, and followed Evelyn back into the safety of the room. Only then did Richard collapse against the wall, chest heaving. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of realization. The night had started like any other. The narrator's voice softens. But before dawn, one act of courage would expose everything Richard Cole had forgotten, and everything he was about to lose. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the child asleep in Evelyn's arms. Richard's throat tightened as he watched her carry Amelia back to bed with the tenderness of a mother and the precision of someone who had done this many times before. When she finally tucked the girl in, Evelyn straightened, her face half hidden by the shadows of the nightlight. Richard exhaled shakily. "You're going to tell me what's going on," he whispered. Evelyn didn't look at him. She only nodded once, her voice calm but heavy. "Not here. Let's talk in the hall." They stepped into the corridor. The silence between them was taut, vibrating with things neither of them yet understood. "You owe me an explanation," he said finally, his tone sharp, trying to reclaim authority he no longer felt. "What was that? Why was my daughter sleepwalking?" Evelyn said softly, cutting him off. "It's been happening for weeks." Richard blinked. "Weeks?" "Yes, sir. Every night around this time." She clasped her hands in front of her, steady but pale. "I didn't mean to frighten you tonight, but if you had shouted, she could have fallen. I had to stop you." He stared at her, disbelief warring with shame. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Her gaze flickered toward him, the faintest glint of hurt behind her professionalism. "You're never here, sir. I tried to reach out through the house staff, but your schedule—" She stopped herself. "I decided to stay late. quietly, just in case. You stayed. Unpaid? Evelyn nodded. I couldn't sleep knowing she might wander again. The words hit him like a blow. A stranger had noticed what he, her father, had not. He turned away, pressing a hand over his eyes. I didn't even know she did that. Evelyn's tone softened. She misses you. Richard's hand dropped. You think this is my fault? She didn't flinch. No, sir. I think she dreams of you so much that her body keeps looking for you, even when she's asleep. That silence again. Deep, heavy, full of meaning. Richard swallowed hard, his throat thick. He wanted to say something. Anything. But the words wouldn't come. Evelyn took a small step closer. When I was a girl, she said quietly, my little sister used to sleepwalk too. One night, she fell from our balcony before anyone could stop her. Her voice broke for the first time. That's why I couldn't leave your daughter alone. Richard's world seemed to tilt slightly. Grief, guilt, gratitude, all at once. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Not as an employee, not as a stranger, but as someone who had already saved his child's life more than once. Thank you, he said finally, the words trembling, for doing what I should have done. Evelyn gave a faint, tired smile. You still can, sir. She just needs you to be here when she wakes. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking deep. And somewhere, far down the hall, the wind brushed against the glass. Quiet, haunting, like a whisper reminding him that silence had nearly cost him everything. The night pressed on, soft and breathless, as if the world outside had paused to listen. Richard leaned against the hallway wall, his reflection faint in the polished glass. The quiet no longer felt comfortable. It was heavy, alive with all the things he'd failed to see. Evelyn stood a few feet away, her posture straight but her eyes dim with fatigue. Her hands were clasped before her, the way she always stood when waiting for orders. But tonight, Richard couldn't bring himself to speak like a master to his servant. Instead, he said quietly, "Tell me everything." She hesitated, glancing down the hall toward Amelia's room before answering. "It started 2 weeks ago," she said softly. "The first night I heard footsteps after midnight. I thought it was you. But when I came out, I saw her, walking toward the balcony." Richard's brow furrowed. "And you didn't wake her?" "I couldn't, not suddenly. It can cause shock." She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "I just guided her back to bed." She never remembered it. The next night, it happened again. "That's when I started staying back after my shift." Richard rubbed his forehead. "Why didn't the night guard or anyone tell me?" "Because I didn't let them," she said. "I was afraid if anyone else found out, they'd treat her like a problem instead of a child. I didn't want her to feel watched, or worse, blamed." There was something raw in the way she said it, protective, maternal. Richard looked at her, at the quiet courage behind her trembling voice. "You've been watching over her all this time. Alone." Evelyn nodded once. "I know it wasn't my place, but I couldn't lose another child that way." Her words hung in the air. Richard blinked. "Another?" Evelyn's eyes glistened in the dim light. "My sister. Her name was Kioma. She was only 8. I was supposed to be watching her that night." Her voice cracked. "She walked out the back door while I was folding laundry. I found her too late." Silence. The kind of silence that hums with pain. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, but every word felt useless. "I promised myself," Evelyn continued, her tone steadying, "that if I ever saw someone sleepwalking again, I'd never stand by, even if it cost me everything." He looked at her, really looked, and realized that this young woman whom he'd barely noticed for 2 weeks had been carrying grief heavier than his own. Her face was tired, but there was light in her eyes. The light of someone who had already fought a battle most couldn't survive. Richard's voice softened. "You didn't just save my daughter tonight, Evelyn. You saved me too." She met his gaze briefly, then looked away. "You don't need saving, sir. You just need to go home more often." Her words struck deeper than she knew. Richard nodded slowly, a faint, bitter smile forming. "Then maybe it's time I learned how." And for the first time in years, the great Richard Cole, a man who built empires, stood in his own home and felt small, but human. The clock in the living room chimed softly. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city pulsed on, indifferent. But in that quiet hallway, two broken souls had found something rare, a shared understanding stitched together by loss and grace. And though the night would soon give way to morning, nothing inside that house would ever be the same again. Morning arrived quietly. The first light slipped through the wide glass panels of the penthouse, touching the marble floors with pale gold. The house, once proud and cold, looked softer now. Like it too had exhaled. Richard hadn't slept. He sat in his study, elbows on his knees, eyes unfocused on the city skyline beyond the window. He had spent half the night replaying Evelyn's words. You just need to go home more often. Simple, brutal, true. In the silence, he noticed things he had never paid attention to. The faint scrape of a chair, the sound of water running somewhere in the kitchen, the rhythmic pattern of small footsteps padding across the hallway. Amelia. For years, his mornings began with conference calls and headlines. Today, for the first time in a long while, he rose and followed the sound of his daughter's laughter. He stopped at the kitchen door. Evelyn stood at the counter, hair tied back neatly, her uniform crisp. She was helping Amelia pour milk into a bowl. The little girl giggled when the milk overflowed. "Oops. It's all right, darling," Evelyn said softly, wiping the spill with a cloth. "Accidents happen. That's how we learn." The words pierced him more deeply than she could have known. He'd built his empire on precision, on never failing. But this small, forgiving chaos, this was living. Amelia noticed him first. "Daddy!" she chirped, eyes lighting up. Her joy was disarming. He smiled weakly, stepping into the light. "Good morning, Princess." "You're up early," she said, surprised. He nodded. "I didn't want to miss breakfast." Evelyn glanced at him briefly, then returned to the stove, saying nothing. Her presence filled the room, quiet but grounding. Richard sat beside Amelia and watched her eat, really watched her. The way her curls framed her tiny face. The way she hummed between bites. How had he missed this? "I like the pancakes," Amelia said, mouth full. "Evelyn makes the best ones," Richard replied. She giggled. "She says you could learn too." Evelyn froze mid-motion, embarrassed. "I didn't mean—" But Richard raised a hand. "She's right." He smiled faintly. "I think it's time I did." For a fleeting second, Evelyn's lips curved in a shy smile. After breakfast, Amelia ran off to get ready for school. The house grew quiet again. Richard lingered at the table. "You've done more for her in 2 weeks than I have in 2 years," he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "No, sir. I just reminded her she's not alone." He looked down, ashamed. "I thought money could fix everything. Private tutors, the best doctors. I never realized what she needed was time." Evelyn met his eyes, steady, kind. Children don't measure love in gifts. They measure it in presence. The words landed softly but deeply. Outside, the city roared back to life. Engines, horns, noise, all the things Richard had once called success. But standing there, watching Evelyn rinse the dishes while sunlight brushed her cheek, he realized something life-changing. He'd been conquering the world, while losing his home. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by warmth and the faint smell of pancakes, Richard Cole made a silent promise that before he rebuilt his empire, he'd learn to rebuild his family. The following days moved differently. Slower, quieter, almost fragile. Richard found himself staying home more often, as if the air in the penthouse had changed and he was afraid to disturb it. He sat through breakfasts, helped Amelia with homework, and tried, awkwardly, to be present. The world outside still called. His phone buzzed with endless meetings, but he began to silence it. And sometimes, late at night, he found himself drawn to the balcony, the same place where his daughter had nearly fallen. The city lights stretched endlessly before him, glittering like the life he had built. But none of it felt real anymore. One night he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Evelyn stood by the doorway, the glow from the living room haloing her figure. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've been sitting out here for hours." Richard smiled faintly. "I didn't realize I was waiting. For what?" He looked down at the city again. "Forgiveness. From my daughter, maybe. From myself." Evelyn's expression softened. She stepped closer, resting her hands lightly on the balcony rail. "Forgiveness isn't earned in a night, sir. It's lived, every day." The words struck something deep in him. You sound like you've had to live it too." For a moment, she didn't answer. Then her voice came low, steady. "After my sister died, I couldn't sleep for years. I blamed myself. I was the older one, the careful one. Everyone told me it wasn't my fault, but—" She trailed off, her voice trembling. Try telling that to a 12-year-old who watched her sister fall. Richard's chest tightened. "Evelyn, I thought if I worked hard enough, helped enough people, maybe I'd pay back a debt that can never really be paid." She gave a sad smile. "That's why I stayed that night when Amelia wandered. I couldn't fail again." The air between them grew heavy. Grief meeting grief. Old wounds recognizing each other. Richard turned to her fully. "You didn't fail anyone. You saved her. You saved me." Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't save her alone. You were here. That's what she needed." He stared at her, the truth cutting deep. He had spent years mastering control, building wealth, commanding power. Yet here was a woman with nothing but compassion, teaching him how to live again. "You know," he said after a long pause, "when my wife died, I buried myself in work because it was the only place I could breathe. Amelia was so small. I thought if I made more money, built more, she'd never have to feel the emptiness I did. But all I did was make it worse." Evelyn turned to him gently. Grief doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for presence. The night wind stirred her hair, brushing it softly across her cheek. She looked at him, not as her employer but as another soul trying to rebuild what had been lost. Richard smiled faintly. "You're wiser than anyone I've ever met." She laughed quietly, the sound soft as rain. "Pain has a way of teaching us faster than comfort ever could." They stood in silence then, two people bound not by wealth or duty, but by the invisible threads of loss and understanding, and as the night deepened, Richard finally realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't something he had to wait for. Maybe it was something he had already been given, through the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let another child fall. That night, for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel alone. The echoes of the past had found their answer, not in silence, but in understanding. Morning came softly, not with the rush of alarms or phone calls, but with the golden quiet of sunlight spilling across the marble floor. For the first time in years, the penthouse didn't feel like a fortress. It felt lived in. The faint scent of pancakes drifted through the air, warm and sweet, replacing the sterile aroma of expensive cologne and polish. Richard woke earlier than usual, long before the driver or the staff. He walked barefoot into the kitchen, still in his house clothes, unshaven and human. Evelyn turned at the sound of his footsteps, surprise flickering across her face. "Good morning, sir," she said quickly, straightening her apron. "Good morning," he replied, softer than usual. His voice carried none of the usual weight of command. "You're up early." "I always am," she said with a small smile. "Children need steady mornings." He nodded, then hesitated. "Let me help today." Her brows rose slightly. "Help?" "Yes," he said, awkwardly rolling up his sleeves. "I've made a lot of deals in my life, but never breakfast. Maybe it's time." For a second, Evelyn almost laughed, but she bit it back. "All right then, Mr. Cole," she said, handing him a mixing bowl. "Let's see what you can do." It was clumsy at first. Flour on the counter, batter on his sleeve, a cracked egg that ran off the edge of the marble. But Amelia's laughter echoed through the kitchen like music, and every mistake only made her giggle louder. "You're a mess, Daddy," she cried. "I'm an artist," he said proudly, flipping a pancake that landed halfway on the plate and halfway on the stove. Evelyn snorted softly behind him. "Careful," she said. "Confidence doesn't always equal skill," he grinned. "Tell that to my investors." The laughter lingered long after breakfast was done. For once, time didn't feel like something he was chasing. It was something he was finally living. Later, after Amelia ran off to get ready for school, Richard leaned against the counter beside Evelyn. The air between them was calm, filled with the soft hum of morning light. "She's happy," he said quietly. "She's safe," Evelyn corrected gently. "Happiness comes from that." He looked at her thoughtful. "You've done more for her than anyone else in this house." Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. You stayed." He smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes softening. "Maybe I should make that a habit." She looked at him then, not as an employee but as someone who understood the fragility of change. "Habits take time," she said. But love grows faster than you think. The words lingered, delicate and true. When Amelia returned, backpack slung over her shoulder, Richard walked her to the elevator himself. A small thing, but it felt monumental. He held her hand as the doors opened, his reflection beside hers in the mirrored wall. As they stepped inside, Evelyn watched from the kitchen doorway, her eyes soft with something unspoken. Pride. Maybe hope? The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in years, the billionaire's reflection didn't look lonely. That morning, Richard Cole stopped being a man haunted by absence. He became a father learning the beauty of being present. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the Cole household changed in quiet, powerful ways. Gone were the rushed mornings and empty evenings. The echoes of business calls were replaced by the sound of Amelia's laughter, the patter of her small feet chasing her father through hallways that had once felt hollow. Richard no longer hid behind boardrooms or meetings. He took calls from home now, sitting on the same couch where his daughter built towers from wooden blocks. Between conference calls, he'd look up and see her smiling at him. It wasn't perfect. He still stumbled over schedules, still burned toast, still forgot where her backpack was. But Evelyn was always there, steady, calm, quietly guiding him. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the sea, blanketing the city in gray. Rain hammered against the windows, lightning splitting the sky. Amelia sat curled on the sofa, clutching her stuffed bunny, eyes wide with fear. Richard set his tablet aside immediately. Hey, what's wrong, sweetheart?" "The thunder," she whispered. "It sounds angry." He smiled softly, kneeling beside her. "Thunder's not angry. It's just clouds talking too loud." Amelia's lips quivered into a smile. "Really? Really?" He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "And no matter how loud it gets, I'm right here, okay?" She nodded, pressing her cheek against his chest. Evelyn watched quietly from the doorway, the stormlight flickering over her face. It was the same scene she had once dreamed of, a child protected not by a stranger, but by love that finally remembered how to stay. When the storm passed, and the city returned to calm, Richard found her in the kitchen. "Drying dishes." "You were right," he said softly. She looked up. "About what?" "Presents. It changes everything." Evelyn set the towel down, meeting his eyes. "You changed everything, Mr. Cole. I only reminded you where to look." He leaned against the counter, thinking. "You make it sound easy." She shook her head gently. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." For a moment, the air between them filled with unspoken gratitude, and something warmer, something neither of them dared name. "I don't say this enough," Richard said. "Thank you, for saving her, for saving me." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I didn't save anyone. I just kept the lights on until you came home." The simplicity of it hit him harder than any lecture ever could. That night, when Amelia was tucked into bed, Richard walked out to the balcony again, but this time, not to brood. He looked at the skyline and saw reflections of what he'd nearly lost, and what he was learning to keep. Behind him, Evelyn's voice floated softly. "She's sleeping peacefully tonight." He turned and smiled. "So am I." For the first time in years, there was no guilt in his chest, no emptiness to fill. Just gratitude, raw and real. And as the night wrapped around the penthouse, Richard Cole finally understood. Wealth could buy walls, but only love could make a home. Morning came wrapped in golden light, the kind that makes everything feel new. The city below was already alive. Horns, voices, the hum of another busy day. But inside the penthouse, peace lingered. The air carried the faint scent of coffee and rain-soaked earth from the night before. Richard stood at the window, watching Amelia chase her reflection across the polished floor. She was giggling, hair wild, her joy untamed. For years he'd measured success in numbers. Now he measured it in laughter. Evelyn appeared quietly behind him, folding freshly laundered towels. Her movements were efficient, graceful, but there was a warmth now. A comfort that filled every corner of the room. "She's happy," Richard said softly. Evelyn nodded, setting the towels down. "She's loved. That's all a child ever needs." He turned to her, eyes thoughtful. "You gave me back my family, Evelyn." She hesitated, lowering her gaze. "I only reminded you it was still here." He smiled faintly. "Then stay. Not as my employee, as part of this home. The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy with meaning. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with surprise, but her voice stayed calm. "I'm not sure I belong here, sir." "You already do," he said gently. "You taught me how to be present, how to be a father again. I can't imagine this house without you in it." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, quietly, she smiled, the kind of smile that holds both gratitude and restraint. "I'll stay," she whispered. "As long as she needs me." Richard nodded. "Then that's forever." Amelia's laughter filled the room again, and both of them turned. She stood on a chair, reaching for something on the counter, a glass of water. The memory of that first night when Evelyn had covered his mouth and begged him not to speak flashed between them like a shared secret. That was the night everything had changed. The night he'd finally seen what silence could mean. Not weakness, but protection. He walked over, lifted his daughter into his arms, and said, "You'll never have to look for me again, sweetheart. I'm home." Amelia smiled sleepily and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. Evelyn watched them, her eyes glistening with quiet pride. Outside, sunlight bathed the skyline. Inside, love filled the spaces money never could. That evening, as the sky blushed orange and pink, the three of them sat together on the balcony. No words, no rush, just presence. The city stretched endlessly before them. But for once, Richard didn't feel small. He felt whole, and as the wind brushed softly against their faces, Richard Cole made a silent promise that he would never again trade moments for meetings, or love for legacy. He turned to Evelyn, his voice low but certain. "Thank you for teaching me what truly matters." She smiled. "It wasn't me, sir. It was love. It just needed someone to listen. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. And sometimes the person you least expect saves the part of you you thought was gone forever." If this story touched your heart, hit like, comment "Love Heals," and share it to remind someone that compassion can change even the coldest hearts.